Hello, everyone. Again, we have two people in the other rooms. Richard, welcome back. And Alexis. Hello, Alexis.
Hello, nice to be here.
Where are you calling from? Because we have different guests all over the planet.
Right, I'm calling in from Paris, France. Although I'm American, but I've been living here for 18 years now.
Right. So on that note, explain me who Alexis Niki is.
So what I do is I am a narrative coach and I'm a storyteller. And that means I actually help people dig in and find their most important stories and live them with authenticity in the world. And I've done this with many different types of people. And for the past few years, I've been doing it within business, working with leaders and with their teams to get them to speak more authentically to one another, connect on values and missions and purpose, and build things together from a different foundation.
Very nice. So I'm gonna ask a tricky question, I think, Alexis, in that how has this industry become a thing? Because a lot of the leaders and executives that I've known over the years would have said that's far too fluffy, and I'm not gonna pay for something like that. So what sort of the driving forces behind narrative coaching and storytelling becoming an important part of contemporary business?
I don't know if I would agree with you that it's become an important part yet. There's a big difference between creating a story that you share with the outside world that is meant to convince and persuade, and the kind of storytelling that I'm talking about, which is a few steps before that. So it's getting the internal stories settled first, internal within each individual, internal within a group or a team, and then together building something from which there's a story that gets created that is shared with the outside world. So that sharing of a story to the outside world is becoming much more a driving force, because we all need attention today. You know, there's so many things bombarding our senses. So how are we going to get people to pay attention to us? It's through persuasive and maybe entertaining story, something that really sparks our imaginations and something that speaks to our emotions. And there's a lot of opportunity for helping people build those kinds of stories. What I'm talking about is something a little bit two steps before that, I think.
So what is two steps before that?
That's like I said, it's really becoming clear that we are storytelling animals. That's what makes us human. It is the way we understand the world. It is the way we explain things to ourselves. It's the way we understand our own identities. We all have narratives about who we are, where we come from, and those are the things that help us make sense of ourselves. So if that's the case, that in some sense, it means we have an innate narrative intelligence. And so I'm all about really making people aware that they have an innate narrative intelligence, that we are already storytellers because we live story every day, we consume story every day, but that it is like the water that fish swim in. It's something that we don't see, that it's a super powerful tool in both senses of the word. It can be super positive, or it can be extremely destructive. It can be constructive or destructive, life affirming or life destroying. And when we're unconscious of it, we do ourselves a major disservice, because we run our stories. We don't even know we're doing it. We're trying to communicate on a different level. We don't understand why things aren't working. And we have what we see each other through sort of warped story lenses in a sense, and we have a clash of narratives, and we can't understand why the other person won't see things our way. So I think it's such an essential part of who we are as human beings, and getting people to see that is the difficult part, because I think a lot of people think, yeah, story, soft, like you said, soft and fluffy. I need the story that's going to sell my product. Sure, I get that, but I don't know what, me working on my stories has anything to do with what I need to get done in the business world.
The question I have as well, Alexis, for you, because you started off. So we have a few terms here, right? So you have narrative, you have story, and storytelling.
Mhm.
Explain me the difference, or what are, if there are any differences, explain that to me.
Yeah, that is a big sticking point. I mean, it is really hard to talk about these things because the language isn't always there. Story is such a gigantic topic. So how do we talk about it? The way I use these words, and sometimes I'm more careful about which word I choose when, but the way I use these words is, for me, story is the big umbrella term. Storytelling is when we're actually using our words to share a story with somebody else. For me, that's storytelling. And narrative is, it's more the, maybe the cultural narratives that underpin everything, or internal narratives, those stories that are running all the time, if we're aware of them or not aware of them. That's the way I try to use these terms for myself. It's what makes sense to me, and it's the way I work with people when I'm explaining it to them. So in business, for example, there's a certain narrative of, there are goals to be attained, and that is all important, right? And on top of those, we have story that we create and live in. But the underlying narrative is almost like the undercurrent that's going beneath all of those stories.
So it's almost if you're talking about narrative, that's almost an unconscious probing. You're trying to reveal the unconscious, whereas story is a more active component where you're getting people to frame something very specific.
I think that's what I think that's how I'm using those terms. And I say I think because, this is a learning process for me too. It's like an exploration into this domain. And the way I came to this domain is, it's really quite experiential, right? So I grew up as the child of Greek immigrant grandparents to the US. My parents were born in the States. All four of my grandparents were immigrants. My father and mother emigrated back to Europe. So already there was like a sense of, who am I, where do I belong, sort of identity, right? We ended up living in Athens, and in an apartment where we could see the Acropolis and the Parthenon on one side and Mount Lycabettus on the other side. And on the Parthenon is the temple that was built to the goddess Athena. My dad would tell me the stories of the mythology of the goddess Athena. And for me, she was not just the patron saint of the city, but she became my patron saint. So I was like really attached to her and imagining her flying through the sky at night. And Mount Lycabettus was a result of some stones that she dropped that she was carrying to bring to the Parthenon. So, and I knew she was a myth. Of course, I knew she wasn't real. But, here was this building that was built to her, and a whole city that was named after her. So I was like, wow, there's something real at the same time not real about this story. And at the same time, my father was telling me stories about the birth of democracy and the philosophers that were walking through town. And this was during a dictatorship in Greece. So I was watching tanks roll through the street, and we had curfews at night. So immediately I was in like this clash of stories. I couldn't figure out what this place was. What did it mean? With all these, but if there are gods and goddesses, and then there's tanks in the street, and but this is the birthplace of democracy. And it was so confusing to me trying to find my way through that. And later I ended up living in Cold War Berlin, which was like another, wow, many, many layers of history and story there, narrative there as well, about how people treat each other, live together, structure their societies, structure their civilizations. So somehow very early on, I was really intrigued by all that undercurrent of narrative and how we build our lives based on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've gone into Greek myth, so am I. The firstborn child of Kronos and Rhea. So Zeus's eldest sister is Hestia, who is the goddess of the hearth, and so that's the idea that the goddess of the hearth. All of the stories appear after the half is there. That is sort of this mythological component, as you say. Story is fundamental to human existence. Without the half to tell stories around, none of the other God stories necessarily appear. And
or
so
the campfire.
Yeah. So that it's fascinating that you
Yeah.
sort of also were birthed in the Greek myths, and that was what grabbed your attention.
And more than the stories themselves, which are wonderful, it was this idea of how an entire society organized around these myths. It wasn't just the Parthenon in Athens. There are temples all over Greece to all sorts of gods, right? And there's vestiges of that time still throughout the country. And of course, the wonderful thing about Greek myths is there's not just one god, there are 12 Olympians and then all sorts of other demigods and everything. And every personality type is represented. And, you know, there's something incredibly rich about those stories that intrigue me to this day. Yeah.
So do you draw upon these kind of mythological themes in your practice?
I don't so much draw upon the mythological themes, but I do draw upon a lot on archetypes. I work a lot with archetypes.
Can you explain that? Just
well, so very intrigued by the 12 basic archetypes that were defined by Jung, that were drawn from myths and mythology, and the connection that he made between that and our human psychology. So, and I have come to believe through long, hard work that we contain all the archetypes within us. They are at least latent within us, right? And each of us have are more drawn to or have certain archetypes that are more active. And these are parts of things that we see in our personality, right? You know, some of us are more the sage, and some of us are more the rebel, and some of us are more the controller and the ruler. Some of us are more the trickster. But all of these archetypes we have inside. So when I'm working with clients and I especially see somebody say something like a leader, right? Who sometimes a female leader who shies away from, like when I present the archetypes, and she's shying away from the magician archetype because it's related to a need for power. She'll shy away from that. Oh, no, because, you know, power is a bad thing. So then we get to explore that. And we get to explore, where does this magician archetype actually show up in her life today? And how does it show up, and how does it manifest? And okay, is it, when it shows up there, is that a bad thing? Usually not. And if it shows there, is that a bad thing? Usually not. So it helps people then begin to integrate the parts of themselves that are powerful, and kind of step into that and understand, to change their thinking and their definition of what being powerful in the world means. It's not necessarily power over somebody else, but it means I have agency, I have choice, what my actions actually impact the world. And owning that, very important, right?
so how does that improve sort of the non-fluffy performance of a leader to have this kind of awareness? Because I have my own understanding of how it might, but I'll be very interested to see some, you know, you've seen it in real time occur. Right. So what kind of stuff do you see happen?
Well, I've seen it, yes, I've seen it in real time occur, and I've worked with so many different types of people because I've been working one-on-one in different capacities for more than 20 years. And what I see always is this leads to coherence, this leads to self-acceptance, right? And when there's a moment of coherence, a moment of self-acceptance, I see people relax and they take a breath and something shifts. And in that shift, they're a little bit more courageous to show up as themselves. And I think that is hugely impactful, or potentially hugely impactful, when we think about leadership, and when we think about what we're facing right now and what kinds of people we need to help us navigate through this.
Is that shift accompanied, I mean, you see it as the external facilitator. Is it accompanied by a sort of a flash of enlightened self-awareness by the leader as well?
Yeah, if there's not that, then I'm like, okay, I see that something happened. If the person doesn't see it yet, it's, it hasn't, but what I'm talking about is those moments of flash of awareness that the leader actually communicates to me. Yeah, I've seen that a lot. Yeah.
What you just explained, Alexis, reminds me a little bit, and of course Richard is in the room as well. He spoke about metaphors, right? So the archetypes that you are talking about, are there similarities? Is that fair, a fair comparison in terms of how you use archetypes with the metaphors? Or if not, what would be the difference?
Well, I think, for example, if we're talking about a metaphor as being something like an organization as a machine, that can be considered a kind of an archetype. Archetypes aren't only restricted to people and personality types, right? An archetype is sort of like you can think of it almost like the first idea on which all other ideas are based. So if you have an archetype of a sage, it can be expressed in so many different ways. You can have the wise old man. You can have the precocious little girl who just is a truth teller and just speaks truth in a particular moment. It can be really expressed in so many different ways. And when we talk about metaphors, it can be the same thing. The organization as a machine can be expressed in so many different ways. So in that sense, the machine metaphor could be seen as an archetype.
So one of the things I do when I talk about metaphor is how they entrap people into single perspectives. So do you do something similar with your archetypes and the storytelling?
Well, I don't talk about it that way, but yes, because what I see is people limit themselves by not daring to go into some of the archetypes. They limit who they can really be, right? And also there is the other part of it, which is like, oh, well, I know I'm this archetype, but I really want to be that archetype, and all the disappointment and I wish I were that way. I think I should be that way. And that's also very limiting, right? And so, yeah, I do work with the limitations of the archetypes, but I do it by encouraging people to step into and explore the other archetypes. So to actually have that experience of expansion for themselves.
How do you do that? So I'm interested in sort of almost the methodologies and the tactics here. So, if what's the process of getting people to do this sort of metaphorical, mythological, archetypal exploration?
I do have certain methods that I work. It depends on how the client comes to me, right? If I'm doing one-on-one coaching, there's an offer that I have with 8 sessions, and those 8 sessions, the first 4 are all about working on values and archetypes and who the person is, and then the next 4 is about creating the story that they want to tell. That's one way. Another way is I'm called in to work with a team, or I'm called in to work with the leader. Usually I'm called in to work with the team, and then the leader does some coaching with me, because if the leader and the team are both doing the work, then it's a mess. And in those moments, I find opportunities. An issue arises, and I'm like, oh, archetypes would be helpful here. So I might pull that out and work with that person sort of more spontaneously around archetypes. But in any case, again, it works one of 2 ways. Either I present the information and we sit around, or by Zoom at this point, around a chart, and we're talking about the archetypes, and they're, telling me stories about where these archetypes appear or don't appear in their lives. And other times I might just say to somebody, wait a minute, who are you being in this moment? What capacities are you drawing on in this moment? And what capacities do you think maybe you could add that might make the situation a little bit better? And then they'll think about that and they'll say something. And then I'll introduce the idea of archetypes and maybe walk them through it a little bit more fully. So it depends how the issue comes up, whether I'm introducing it as part of a structured program that I have, or if I'm just responding spontaneously to a need that I see.
Okay, thank you.
Mm.
I'm also quite interested, so I know from previous chats with you is that one of your great success stories was an Asian lady, and sort of, it wasn't really archetypes, that was the change of narrative. That was a probing of this underlying narrative that was restricting her from achieving, and you freed it. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's a nice way to sort of explore the difference between what we've just been talking about and the other part of your work.
Yeah, no, that was a really interesting situation, because the person, her superior who hired me to work with her, is somebody that I've worked with before, a client who I know quite well. And so I very much trusted his instincts when he was saying, you know, on one level, he was like, you know, this is such an important part of her job. She needs to write this email that's going to go to all the, you know, CEO, and, you know, and it's totally incomprehensible. But, and I might have to fire her, but you know, she's so talented that, you know, I want you to work with her. It's sort of like it's the last step kind of thing. So I trusted that very much. And going in there, and he was right about everything he saw in her. I saw in her too. She was very personable, very energetic, really wanting to do a good job. I'll take his word for it that she was a brilliant analyst, you know. And
are you suggesting you can't do financial analysts analysis, Alexis?
No. Okay. And, you know, but what I can tell you though, which is interesting, because I learned this too, I can read the email and say, this is totally incomprehensible. And then I can read the improvement and say, this is comprehensible for those who can understand it. I still don't understand it, but it's comprehensible, right? So that's interesting to see. So the more I worked with her, the more I just became curious about what was it that was blocking her. And I could sense there was some underlying belief. And as I remember it, you know, there was a lot of indirect procedures, which is something I talk about a lot and I use a lot. So if you're really trying to kind of force an issue, sometimes you're not going to get anywhere. So you need to try, you know, different ways. So I was doing a little bit of teaching about how to communicate data in a way that allows other people to come in. We were doing even some like more playful game kind of things, so that she could step out of her I want to do well right away mindset, so she could kind of relax a little bit. And in the process of doing these different types of things with her, it arose that she was holding this really deep belief that she could not tell her superiors something that she knew. Because in China, you don't do that. You never assume that your superiors don't have the same knowledge that you have. So the way you communicate is going to be very different. And she did not understand, no matter how many times her superior told her, maybe I told her even in the coaching sessions, what you are being asked to do is exactly that. You're asked to present the data and also give your analysis, right? It's not just present the data. It's present the data and give your analysis. And I remember with her, I actually helped her integrate some metaphors so that her analysis would make more immediate sense to people quickly needing to read this email in the morning and then make their decisions based on that email. So it was a very multi-layered approach with her. There's a little bit of information about how to communicate data using storytelling, stepping into metaphor and things like that. It's a little bit more playful approach that kind of had nothing to do with data and things like that. And just staying curious and staying with her until it finally emerged that this was the issue blocking it. And once she saw that, it changed. You know, it really changed very quickly.
Okay, so there was this, again, was it a sort of after all of these oblique sideways tactics, again, was this sort of this flash of insight, and then the change happened super rapidly. So she went from really not being able to do it to being quite skilled in a very short period of time.
She, when she made the statement, she made it as if, but everybody knows that this is how it is, right? It took me to point out to her that her thinking was faulty. When she shared it with me, it was almost as if the only reason she hadn't shared it with anyone before is because it was so obvious, right? Why say something that everybody already knows? So she finally said it. And then it was me stopping her and pointing out and saying, you just said this thing, but look at what you're being asked to do. And there's a huge gap between what you think you should be doing and what you're actually being asked to do. You know, you're not in China, you're here, it's an international company. You're being asked for this information, not because you are being asked to make a decision for upper management, but because they need this information to be able to make their decisions, right? And you need to be able to deliver that information as clearly and as completely as you possibly can. And that's when she understood.
Alexis, you spoke. You've been talking about archetypes and metaphors, and also in this particular story as well. But it seems so you have a whole toolbox of different tactics. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about going beyond the archetypes. What other
Yeah.
tactics you actually work with?
Yeah. So I started to say, you know, my pathway to the work that I do today has been multi-layered. Part of it is really my own cultural confusion. Who am I? Where do I belong? Where am I from? That sort of thing. Another part of it is that I am a trained teacher of something called the Alexander technique, which is difficult to explain, but in a nutshell, what it does is it's a mind-body method that's used a lot by actors and musicians and other people. And what it helps you do is become aware of your habits of body and mind. So, and close the gaps between what you think you're doing and what you're actually doing. So, what I just described with this client of mine was exactly based on that philosophy, right? She thought she was doing what she was being asked to do. She hadn't actually stopped to hear and to listen and to integrate and to understand what she was being asked to do. And until I was able to make her aware of that gap between her habit and what she was actually being asked to do, she couldn't have that flash of insight. So that training as a teacher of the Alexander technique, and I worked as a teacher for a very long time with, you know, musicians and orchestras and all sorts of creative people, and also people in of all walks of life, really, helped me see that across the board, we all have those same blind spots, and how that works, and how people can be made aware of those blind spots and what it takes for them to be able to step in and change them, to choose to change them, right? None of this is people choose to change these habits or they choose not to change these habits. And I've actually had students who are like, oh, no, thanks. I don't want to change that habit. And you're like, okay, that's fine. But now you're aware of it, right? So that was one part. And another part is that as I was training as a teacher of the Alexander technique, I was living in Germany and I was translating. And I started translating for film and television scripts, and I did a lot of subtitling for films. And they were a lot of bad scripts. I was reading German scripts, translating them into English, and I kept saying, you know, I can do better than this. I want to do my own writing. I've always written. I've been writing since I was a kid. So I learned how to write scripts, and I started working as a screenwriter, mostly for independent productions, and also working as a coach for other writers. And it was the same thing. I was seeing the same gaps. I was seeing, you know, what a writer-director thinks their movie should be versus what was the story they were really trying to tell. I became really good at seeing, like, well, you're writing all of this, but I think really underneath it, this is what's emerging. And I became really good at helping writers see that, and then step into their stories and own their stories and actually tell the story that they wanted to tell, which takes courage, and it takes all sorts of things. So those are the strands that kind of feed into the work that I do. And basically what I did is I brought this way of being that I learned through the Alexander technique, and the storytelling piece. I've merged them together, and using also some other tools, because in another former life, I was also a visual artist. So sometimes I use, some creative tools to get people to open up differently. Yeah, I do have what I've kind of put together a unique toolbox to draw from and to help people step outside of themselves, in a sense, in order to step into themselves.
So you go, Oscar.
Yeah. So one more question, but because you talked about the Alexander technique. I'm curious about how that would apply to. You said you worked with musicians and creative people.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example how you would apply that? How would that help them?
Well, it's a mind-body method. So it's something where they're learning how to let go of excess tension in their body and move differently and hold their instrument differently. So instead of holding a violin like this, they'll learn how to do this. It's a whole framework. And me as a teacher, I use my hands on people to guide them into these different positions. But beneath that, so from the out, it's like story in a sense, right? Story from the outside looks like this thing that you create to share with the outside world, but there's so much more behind it. In the Alexander technique, it looks like it's something so you can learn better posture and better movement and the right way to hold your instrument. But beneath it is the way we respond to stimulus and to stress, right? So for example, if we go back to the analyst, her response to being asked to do this email was her habit, because she hadn't even really heard what she was being asked. And she hadn't made the transition to she's not in China anymore, right? So she was kind of blocking that, and she was running her habit. Musicians and actors can do the same thing, right? You've learned after years and years and years and years of training on your instrument to hold the instrument a certain way, or even more insidious than that, that your problem at the instrument comes from because your hands are too small. So there's really nothing you can do about the size of your hands. So you try to compensate by doing some other things. And you've added stress to yourself, you've misdiagnosed the problem, and your compensations are sending you in the wrong direction in another way. So when you begin to unpack all of that, you say the underlying narrative is my hands are too small. All right, are they? Let's try it. Let's check it out. Let's see if that's actually accurate. And most of the time it isn't. Most of the time there's, something beneath that might need a little bit of work. It might be the way you're interpreting the piece. It might be the pressure you're putting on yourself. It might be perfectionism. It might be, there's so many other things beneath this idea of my hand is too small. Because one teacher told me one time that my hand was too small, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of that going on in the world. There's some kind of script running underneath everything you do that you're not aware of, and it prevents you from acting out in a way that needs to be. I know people who you in other very good coaches who try and make that script explicit. So every time you see it, you name the script, and so it becomes a thing separate from you.
Yeah.
So I think the way I've listened to and sort of understood what you do at the moment, we've looked at the self, so sort of the archetypes and understanding the self, and then sort of an unconscious dark side probing of some of these narratives that stop performance. But you were moving in towards more of understanding plot. So creating longer stories, and writing these dramas and etc. So do you use sort of a deeper plot-based structure in what you do as well?
I am it feels like there are two schools of storytellers, right? The plot-driven ones and the character-driven ones. And I am of the school of character, a plot is character, because without a character having a goal and wanting something, who cares what happens, right? It's the characters who drive the plot. So that's where I live on that. You know, I do a lot of, when I write my stories, which I haven't written a story in a while, but when I write my stories, it's really getting to understand who these characters are, and then putting them in situations and getting out of the way so that they can respond to the situations as who they are. And that's what I find so exciting about writing stories.
Is there a specific mechanic to that you sort of get the character and they move through a journey of some kind?
Yeah, there's the basic hero's journey, but more interestingly than that for me, because this is the kind of writer I am, is this idea of archetype, right? In writing, we say that, and it is so true, that the protagonist is the hardest character to write, because the protagonist reflects the author in so many ways. So it's really hard to get the distance that you need on your protagonist to make them come alive in a certain way. And after a while, I realized, well, you know, when you decide who the protagonist is and what their goal is, that's how you begin to imagine who the other characters are going to be. Like, who does this protagonist need to encounter? Who does he need to have as a mentor? Who does he need to argue? You know, who are the other people that are going to fill out this protagonist's life and either help or hinder him or her on this journey? And once I started seeing that all of those characters, they are archetypes, but all of those characters are kind of related to those internal archetypes that I think we all embody within ourselves, that they all kind of reflect, every character is a self-portrait of the author, right? That's when it became really interesting, because you can then explore aspects of these archetypes that you don't usually maybe have the courage to live in your own life, but you can live them differently on the page. And somehow that really made that come alive for me. And when I share that with the writers that I've coached, it's been really, really helpful for them as well, to see that this is a complete world, in a sense, that you're building with these characters, and they need to complement each other. They need to complement each other in a way that creates sort of dynamic forward movement in the story.
And do you bring that into the organizational coaching as well? This interrelationship between archetypes and the various roles everybody needs to play in order to progress?
I would, yes, I would love to. I haven't done it yet. And part of the reason is that I'm in France, functioning in French, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the things that I can do with my one-on-one clients in English, I have a harder time doing within a French environment. My French is good. I mean, it's pretty fluent, but it's more than language. It's a deep cultural understanding and, you know, getting inside of it. And part of my strength in what I do in France is that I'm the outsider, but then there are other moments where it really helps to be more of an insider. And I think when we're talking about archetypes and the way they're understood within a culture and played out within a culture, I feel like I'm a little bit too outside of that right now with some of the clients that I'm working with. What I do is I really create containers and environments and safe spaces where people can explore their lived experiences together. So I can facilitate an emerging of, you know, maybe there's certain archetypes that emerge that are visible within that particular team or within that particular company. But it's a different way of, it's more like if I see it and I can capture it and I can talk about it in the moment, then yes, I'll work with it, rather than it's something that I'm facilitating, purposefully facilitating.
Wonderful. There's the way you're talking, there's a couple of things that keep on popping into mind. So one is a piece of research by Adam Grant, where he talks about the hobbies of Nobel Prize winners. And he lists all the hobbies, and by far most hobbied hobby, so the hobby most of them have is dramatic arts. So you know, on one hand they're brilliant at their science, but on the other hand there's this ability to play, to be interested in stories and to play out stories and things like this. And then I've also been reading McGilchrist's work on the divided brain, and he also argues that the best training that you can get is dramatic training, because that trains the left side of the brain, because you have to learn the lines. And that's the side of the brain that deals with learning the lines. But then the right side of the brain with all of the multiple interpretations, all of the emotions, and how you have to relate with characters, etc., etc. So do you see your work as sort of contributing to within that frame? And then, you know, is it possible that that kind of development is the thing that's going to create a generation of leaders that can step further than the current generation?
So personally, I never think of the divided brain, but I do think of integration. I talk about integration all the time. And I do see that we split ourselves all the time at work. And this is something that came up in the drinking dialogues that I thought was just, I can't believe I hadn't seen it before. I was in a group and I'd said something about how when we go to work, we're asked to put our emotions aside and, you know, step into the work and, you know, be productive. And I said, but, you know, we're human beings, we're not machines. And somebody else, I can't remember who, said, yeah, and isn't it funny that we're trying to make our machines more human by imbuing them with empathy and with artificial intelligence? And I'm like, yeah, we are doing that. What is that about? Why are we trying to take the humanity, the emotional, empathetic part out of people and then put it into machines? Like, what are we doing? I don't understand that. And to speak of metaphors, you know, the old metaphors of, and I think it's continuing, you know, how organizations should be: produce, 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 produce. And we're also telling people that at the same time, we need you to be innovative. We need you to be creative. We need you to, you know, be responsible and take initiative and all those things. But within a context where we've actually kind of numbed people out of their creativity and out of the responsiveness and out of their, it's not safe for people to bring up ideas. It's not safe for them to say this isn't working for this reason or things like that. So we're really asking conflicting things of people. And it's because we have this underlying belief that when we want to, when we need to, we can just become machines. And when we need to, we can step into our humanity and our creativity and all that stuff. And we don't realize that that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah. So you're actually exploring McGilchrist's divided brain thesis here. His argument is, yeah, we've got this belief system in organizations that we're this we can be this mechanical left brain rational being, and divide it from the right, where all of this other, and actually know that whilst there's a reason for division, because the hemispheres are divided, the integration is everything. And because what his argument is, over the ages, we've either had holistic eras, so the Renaissance and the Romantic eras were holistic, and left brain eras, which are Enlightenment and modernism, where we're forgetting the dramatic stuff, we're forgetting this more human stuff. So I'm wondering, from what you said there, that the fact that we're trying to make robots look more human, is this an indication that we're beginning to see that we need to switch back? Or is it just a deep irony where you're just going, oh my God, what are you doing?
I think it's scarier than that. I think we think, you know, the people who are creating these AIs, of course it's exciting for them and on this cutting edge of research, and it's deeply, deeply fascinating, right? But I think on some level, people believe that we can control this. If we can control the machine and control the emotion in the machine, then we don't have to actually deal with people and emotions, right? People and emotions scare us because they're out of our control. So I think it's, you know, emotion is okay here because we programmed it. We can unprogram it, right? But not okay in a human being. So I think that's where we're at. And I also think And this is getting back a little bit to the deep lessons that I've learned through the Alexander technique, which is really about the indivisibility of body and mind. So there is not body and mind. It's one and the same, right? So we're sitting here right now, we're having a conversation. And most people would say, you know, it's a very intellectual thing. It's a very mind-oriented thing. But my mouth is moving, my hands are moving, I'm looking at you, my voice, this is all body. It's completely indivisible. And you see, you know, an athlete scoring a touchdown, he's not doing it mindlessly, right? He's, you know, all out making a physical effort, but it's not without the mind being involved. And it's the very same thing when we try to divide ourselves into like the productive machines and leave the emotion at home. We're not rational beings. We never leave the emotion at home. Everything that we do has an underlying emotional tension to it. You know, and even if it's the belief that I better produce this because, you know, I'll get in trouble if I don't, that's emotion right there, right?
So if you would look forward, so what you describe is machines are becoming more emotional. Who knows if that's gonna work or not? Maybe in
Who
50
knows?
years. But if that does happen, what would be then the role? Can we become more emotional as well? Then, because machine can actually do the emotional work that we not really good at.
I
And
honestly, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know about that. It's like a big, you know, it might help, it might bring us to a point where we have to rethink who we are. And sometimes it feels like that's where we're going. Who are we as human beings when we can embed machines in us? Then what happens, right? I don't know. And one of the things, and this is where narrative intelligence comes in, one of the things that is sort of like the last bastions of humans versus machines is our ability to tell stories. And there's a lot of advancement that's going on in artificial intelligence and toward making AI more narratively intelligent. So there are already programs and algorithms that can take a lot of different inputs and produce a text that may be dry and boring, but actually coheres and makes sense. So that ability already exists today. However, I don't know that, I mean, I really don't know because I'm not an expert in AI at all, but I don't know whether this deep immersion that we have in story as human beings that we've been talking about, these stories that we received, these scripts that we live, the narratives that underlie our civilizations, will a machine ever be able to understand them the way we do? Will the machine's understanding of them be more liberating somehow than our understanding of it? That I really don't know about. You know, I don't know about how when we interact with other people, there's so much that happens sort of beneath the surface and intuitively that we can't even grasp and maybe create data around to put into a machine right now, right? And that's where the big mysteries are. But I think our ability, and this is probably another reason, or definitely another reason why I'm so, I feel like I'm almost like an activist about narrative intelligence, right? Because it is so fundamentally human. And I do think that it can be the basis from which we can access all those capabilities we need already, but we're definitely going to need even more in the future. It's not just about telling the story, but it's about how we respond. It's about who we want to be. Story, you know, defining who we want to be, like really, really drilling it down and getting to the core of who is it? How do we want to be in this world? How do we want to show up? Those are huge questions, and it takes time and it takes effort and it takes work to get to them. And those are things that people don't have a lot of right now, you know? So, yeah.
the other question I was thinking of, and if you talk about future leadership, right, in terms of narrative, if you look at, let's say, the leaders of the future, um, do you see in particular narrative happening or evolving or emerging that's across, well, maybe within, you are based in France, but If you look at global corporations, do you see particular trends emerging there?
Well, there are the narratives that we pay lip service to, and then there are the narratives that we actually live. And I think for me right now, more than a corporate narrative, I think one of the most obvious public narratives and narrative changes recently is the one that happened in the US, right? We had 4 years of a narrative that was very, very toxic. And now we have a narrative where there's a leader who is aware of the need to really turn that narrative around and create a different kind of, it's almost like, okay, it's what I was talking about. It's a narrative of who do we want to be, right? Deliberately changing that narrative and trying to redirect it. We see that playing out right now. What the results are going to be and where we end up, how much Biden's going to be able to do, I don't know, but he is deliberately trying to change that toxic narrative and guide us toward a more hopeful and positive one. That's clear. That reframe for me is really clear. I don't know that I see corporations, any corporations right now, stepping into a big public seizing of a narrative in that sense. I mean, yes, they're doing it, for their companies, but not on behalf of the greater good.
So I'm going to ask you, we always ask everyone a $9 trillion question. So Oscar and I use $9 trillion as sort of, this is how much money organizations are losing by failing to take on board a lot of this thinking, and being dragged back into industrial age thinking rather than progressing. So I'm looking from what you've been saying, the idea of the embodied self. So that the organizations accept the embodied self and its mind-body combination, and take seriously the dramatic arts and the various parts of narrative intelligence and narrative psychology, and the fact that story is central to human existence and then potentially central to organizational performance. If we can put that at the center of organizations, and I recognize it can be no more than an educated guess, but what would you see happening in terms of performance increases?
If we put narrative intelligence at the heart of our lives in organizations and otherwise, the first thing that I can see, and I've seen with my clients, is this idea of greater self-acceptance. So I think one of the reasons that we disembody is because we don't accept ourselves as we are. We don't accept ourselves as limited and flawed and emotional and out of control and, capricious and all those things that make us human. So self-acceptance, right? And once there's self-acceptance, then there's less blaming of the other and less finger pointing and less division and more curiosity and more empathy that can be extended to other people. So there's that. And I think it would represent possibly a huge shift in our values and what we consider important, right? When we get in touch with that, when we get in touch with, I no longer have to posture so much, to achieve. I no longer have to win at all costs, because that narrative is toxic. Oh, I see that narrative, and now I see it's toxic, right? Now what? What's the opportunity? What can I do now? We have more choice. We're not in those, deeply honed grooves of behavior or habitual behavior. We have choice. And when we have choice, we can have different outcomes. And that's that's a possibility that I see. But I see it's not just in the organizations. We have to start, in schools that prepare people for organizations. People come into organizations already formatted for organizational life. So, and each person, I think, is, and also the other thing that I'm certain of, the more aware we are of narrative intelligence, the less likely we'll fall for the those faulty, toxic narratives that are fear-driven and that are, that we are subjected to so that somebody else can have power over us.
Wonderful. So you went a bit dystopianly dark for a second there, Alexis, but you filled me back up with hope. So that's wonderful. Thank you for that answer.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how this narrative will unfold over the next few years. And we'll have to probably get you back in a few years' time again and talk about the same subject.
Yeah, right.
Alexis, thanks for your time, and Richard as well.
Thank you for the
See you soon.
invitation. It was
Thank
good
you.
fun.
Yeah, good
Bye.
fun. Thank you. Bye-bye.